This DVD training is for those seeking to grow more of their own food using as little store-bought feed or fertilizer as possible. The filming has been done on a family farm where we depend on these systems to grow a significant part of our diet. On the farm, we use about 30 acres of land, but that much area is really not necessary, and much of what we'll be showing you can be implemented in a large suburban backyard. We're a family of 2 adults and 2 children. We've built most of the infrastructure ourselves with some help from family and friends. The day-to-day work is done primarily by one person in approximately 2 to 4 hours per day. About 6 years ago, we became concerned there may be a collapse of the systems we normally depend on for our basic needs of food and water. We began the journey to become more self-reliant. Currently, we grow almost all of the meat and eggs we eat, a good portion of our vegetables, and some of the fruits. At this point, we are very close to having all the feed for our animals and all of the fertilizer for the plants be generated here on site. We do occasionally use commercial organic fertilizers, commercial feed, and technology because they're a helpful bridge. They're time-saving and convenient. We've made many mistakes. A lot of them came from a sense of panic and trying to get too much done too quickly. If you're concerned about living in difficult times, the things that we've learned here can help you. We're located in a rural community in central Texas. Growing food here is very challenging. The weather patterns contrast wildly from years with heavy rains, up to 60+ inches in a year, and such lush growth that we have difficulty finding the cows, to a recent situation where we were in drought with less than an inch of rain per month for 20 months. The summers here are typically hot and dry, with 10 to 30 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters range from mild to bizarrely cold, such as in March of 1987 when it got down to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Hail in April and May is common. The last frost date is on average in mid-March, but we often have a late freeze in early April. The soil at this site is primarily sand with essentially no organic matter. The subsoil is orange-red clay at various depths. Sometimes it's up at the surface, like at the top of this hill. Sometimes it's up to 10 feet deep. Of the approximately 30 acres that we are using, most of the outer areas are pastures that are cross-fenced into separate paddocks for rotational grazing of the miniature dairy cattle. Note that we won't be focusing on large livestock or large acreage in this video. We present this to demonstrate that rotation of crops and animals is needed regardless of scale. From our experience to date, the approximately 20 acres of pasture can support 2 miniature Dexter cows if their calves are removed early. It takes a lot of land for a glass of milk. The bulk of our living and growing area is on less than 2 acres, and as already mentioned, much of what we will be showing can be fit into a suburban backyard. The principles are the same regardless of the size of land you have to work with. Our homestead, gardens, and orchard are located around the top of a hill. This is not an ideal location as hilltops have poorer soils, if any, high winds, and greater fire hazards. There are some advantages, such as generating power from wind and being able to feed water via gravity, but if you have a choice, growing food is often easier in a valley. There are many different ways to set up food production systems, and in this DVD training we show you what has worked at this particular site. It takes about a decade to get the skills and experience to become reasonably self-reliant. This is a multi-year journey with many challenges. We intend this DVD to be a video tutorial to get you started, and a reference for you to come back to as your skills and systems expand. Water is the most critical element in your backyard food production system. Not all water is the same. The different qualities of water depend on its source. Rainwater is the best water and is often called the gold standard for garden plants and trees. Nothing brings your garden to life like a good rain. Pond water is the next best water if the pond is healthy and contains life and fertility. Well water is usually good. Make sure you've had it tested to know if there are some minerals that need to be compensated for. And the worst water is the community or public water systems. But by all means, if that's what you got, use it. Water is such a critical element in the whole process, you should strive to have at least 3 different sources of water available to you. How much water do you need? Well, the answer to that question varies greatly by a lot of factors, but we can give you some guidelines to help you estimate your usage. First of all, your domestic needs such as drinking water, cooking, and hygiene is minimal compared to the requirements for irrigation of the garden and orchard. For example, Our household usage for a family of 4 averages around 30 to 50 gallons a day without any conservation effort at all. Similarly, poultry and rabbits use only a few gallons each day at the most. Your largest use of water will be for food-producing plants. To help you estimate your water needs, there's a simple formula which comes in handy for all sorts of water calculations. The amount of water that 1 inch of rainfall puts on 1 square foot of area equals 6/10 of a gallon. A rough guideline for fruit and nut-producing trees is that they require approximately 1 inch of rainfall per week. Note that your soil type affects your water usage. Clay-based soils may need less water than the estimated value, and sandy soils may need double or more water than the calculated estimates suggest. A very satisfying aspect of building soil has been to see how much less water our sandy soils need as we've increased organic matter and have better soil microbiology. The guideline of about 1 inch of water per week is also appropriate in the garden. You can use the same equation to estimate how much water you will need based on how many square feet of garden space you have. There are many other factors that affect your plant's water needs, such as the amount of mulch, the wind, and cloud cover. Watch the garden and orchard sections for more details on watering to get a better sense of how these factors affect water consumption. Our total water usage varies widely depending on the season. At the low end of the spectrum, which occurs during heavy regular rainfalls and mild temperatures, our total usage is only about 30 to 50 gallons per day, and that's primarily our household needs. At the other extreme, which occurs during the heat of summer in drought, we've used about 1,000 gallons a day, which included irrigating an orchard with approximately 40 trees, the 750 square feet of bed space in the garden, 8 cows, the poultry, and the needs of our family of 4 people, and other miscellaneous farm needs. Water is so important, we're working to create collection systems off of every roof we have. We'll show you some of the systems we have. They range from being big and complex to being very simple. In the Documents section, we have included for your reference an excellent manual on how to build a rainwater collection system. It's written by the Texas Water Development Board, and we've found it very useful. Our biggest rainwater collection system collects water off the roof of this 2,400 square foot barn. To determine how much water you can collect from a roof, you use the same formula as before. The amount of water that 1 inch of rainfall puts on 1 square foot of area equals 6/10 of a gallon. Note that you only need to know the area the roof covers. The pitch or slope of the roof is not a factor. From the 2,400 square foot barn, we collect 1,440 gallons of water with every inch of rain that falls. There is a total of 34,000 gallons of storage capacity in these tanks around the barn. The location of the big barn at the top of the hill works out great for distributing the rainwater via gravity. Here are some details about how our system is built. Each tank is installed on a level platform made of homemade concrete, which is a mixture of sand and clay. After 6 years of use, although the wooden forms are falling apart, the platforms are solid and functional. All of the tanks and platforms on both sides of the barn are within 1 inch of level of each other. In a multiple tank storage system, the lowest tank dictates the maximum storage capacity of the system, so all the tanks need to be as level as possible. In the final section of this DVD, we will show you how to make and use a water level. All of the tanks in the rainwater collection system are connected via an underground manifold. Having pipe underground prevents damage during freezes in winter. Each tank has a valve to connect or disconnect it from the main underground manifold. We chose to use poly tanks for several reasons. They are easier to install by us as individuals. They are very cost-effective in gallons of tank per dollar, and they have low maintenance needs, especially as compared to concrete tanks, which are prone to cracking. And they have a fairly long life. We do not know the exact lifetime of the tanks, but we've seen 20-year-old tanks still in use. We are experimenting with a Glidden primer that adheres well to the poly and will provide extra protection from sunlight, which should help the tank last longer. Here's how the system works. Rain falling onto the roof moves into the gutters. Note that the size of the gutter and the lengths of the gutters is carefully designed. This system is set up to handle a maximum of a 7-inch per hour rain event, which can occur here. Smaller gutters or longer gutter lengths will reduce the size of rain event the system can handle. The roof washers are pipes that fill up with the first water from the rooftop. The first water has the debris from the trees and the birds and etc. We regularly open the valves to release the dirty roof washer water. Notice that we paint our exposed PVC piping to protect it from sunlight, which will increase its usable lifetime. Note also that we have connected the drains from the kitchen sinks and our roof washers into a gray water system. Gray water is used water from sinks or showers. Black water is water that contains feces and/or urine. A gray water line is a perforated pipe wrapped in a cloth sock and buried in the ground. The gray water is piped over here to nurture a series of bushes and vines that we are encouraging to grow over the tanks to provide even more sheltering from the sun. The bushes are Ebengii versus Elaeagnus, which is a fairly common landscaping plant that is very useful. It fixes nitrogen and produces small edible berries. Note that we do not use heavily fruiting plants like grapes, as that would create a maintenance nightmare with heavy fruit drop in between the tanks. We intentionally have a row of tanks here to create a wall of water. We intend to create an arbor over the top of which will grow vines to create a cool microclimate for working in the summer. Pliny Fisk of the CMBP in East Austin, the Center for Maximum Building Potential, has an excellent demonstration of how comfortable a space like this can be, even in August. Rainwater collection can be much simpler than the big systems up at the barn, especially if you're using it primarily for livestock watering or small irrigation projects. Here is a simple gutter collecting water that goes into this barrel. The screen is for keeping out debris and mosquitoes. The water goes into a small bucket with a float valve for animal watering. We believe that float valves will be available for quite some time, as they are in the back of every toilet. Note that you really want your collection barrels to be opaque to light. If it was not originally some dark color, then paint it. White-colored barrels allow algae to grow and create extra work in cleaning. It seems like the white ones are always the ones that are more available, though. Here we have a small chicken pen that has its own rainwater collection system built in. Here is another simple collection system we just haven't gotten finished yet, and sometimes that last connection can be so hard. It became obvious to us in the middle of the second big drought that we could not live on rainwater collection systems alone. So we had a well drilled. It cost about $13,000 to get this hole, which is 476 feet deep. The pump is an additional cost. The knowledge that you can't live from a rainwater collection system alone was a hard lesson for us, both because of the expense and because it means a greater dependence on technology. Hindsight is 20/20 though, and if we were to do it again, we would have drilled the well first and only install 14,000 gallons of capacity in tanks. Tanks are still very much needed for storage of well water and collection of rainwater. Most of us don't have a lot of room or enough water for a big pond, but even a tiny one like this really enhances your lifestyle. And more importantly, it provides water to beneficial insects and birds. Note that when placing a pond, that ponds shaded by trees have less evaporation and stay fuller longer in these arid climates. If you are lucky enough to have a bigger pond, stocking a pond with catfish has by far been the easiest food source we've generated. The Texas Agricultural Extension Service has an excellent booklet on raising catfish in small ponds, which is in the DVD documents section. Unfortunately, the water level in our pond varies significantly, from up to about a quarter acre in size in rainy years, down to almost nothing in drought. So this food source is not that reliable, but it is easy when it works. Aquaponics is a method of growing food in a series of barrels or small ponds where you use the excrement of the fish to fertilize plants, and then the plants to clean the waters for the fish. The folks who implement these systems claim some pretty high food production in a very small space. We haven't had a chance to develop any of these systems yet, but we feel it's worth investigating. We've included some introductory articles to get you started if you're interested. The heart of your backyard food production system is in the garden. Let's start with where you want to put your garden if you have a choice. We tried 4 different places and learned a lot from each location. Many gardening books are written for gardeners in the northeastern part of the U.S., And that wisdom says to plant on the south-facing slope. So we put our first garden on this south-facing pasture. We laid out at least 4 or 5 layers of cardboard to cover the Bermuda grass, and then we piled up an 18-inch thick mat of hay on top of the cardboard. We punched holes through the cardboard and planted down in that. Here in Texas and most of the Southwest, we have an intensity of sun. With the continual wind and heat on that south-facing slope, we could never keep anything moist enough to grow. We also found that Bermuda grass has no problem finding its way through that much cardboard and mulch. Our next 2 garden sites were in the orchard area on the northeast slope, which was better in terms of the coolness and moisture. And the main lessons that we learned again were that Bermuda grass is a formidable challenge, and even a short walk of 150 to 250 feet was too far away. The garden has to be right by the house if it's going to be tended well. It's why they're often called kitchen gardens. Another consideration in locating your garden is the effects of shade or trees or structures surrounding your garden. These shadow maps drawn during the summer solstice are an easy and helpful tool you can use to get a sense of how much light an area gets. Getting morning sun and afternoon shade is an ideal combination for Southwest gardens. How much garden area do you need? Fortunately, a man named John Jevons has been working on this question since the 1970s. He's developed a complete method of sustainably growing food called biointensive gardening. We keep coming back to this method as it's designed to provide a complete diet taking into consideration proteins, fats, carbohydrates, minerals, and vitamins that you need. The method is used throughout the world, and it assumes that you start out with little soil or money. From the biointensive research, to sustainably grow the entire food needs of one person requires 4,000 square feet of growing space. This drawing shows 40 100 square foot beds. You can fit these 40 growing beds into a 7,500 square foot area if the paths are mostly about 1 foot wide. This is the space needed for a complete vegetarian diet for one person. Now, of those 4,000 square foot of growing beds, 2,800 square feet are primarily for growing compost materials to replenish fertility in the system, and only 1,200 square feet is for active food production. The biointensive method focuses on a vegetarian diet in many places in the world where his methods are used that people can't afford any livestock. In our garden, we have a small rabbitry. The rabbits provide meat and, almost more importantly, fertilizer. Our setup here with 750 square feet of bed space and the 8-cage rabbit hutch is enough to feed one person fairly well year-round. Now, this is not a complete system as it depends on bringing in cut greens and grasses for the rabbits and hay for both the rabbits and for mulch. Once it is established and you have the experience to manage it, it takes about 10 to 15 hours per week to grow all the food you need in a setup like this. Our inspiration for the garden rabbit synergy comes from a missionary group outside of Waco, Texas called World Hunger Relief. World Hunger Relief has a manual titled Backyard Food Production, which we highly recommend. They also offer courses and workshops. After trying the other locations, each with really big areas, we started this garden with just one bed and then added more space slowly each season. And we highly recommend that you start small. Jevons thoroughly describes the biointensive gardening method in the book, How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible in Less Space Than You Ever Imagined. An easier introduction to the method is contained in the book, The Sustainable Vegetable Garden, also written by Jevons. We can't teach you the whole method on this video, but here are some key points. In a new garden, measure and stake out a bed. Many of the beds in this garden are 4 feet by 12.5 feet for a total of 50 square foot per bed. This is actually an established bed, and we will explain why we have these trees in the middle of the row later in the section. For a new bed, if you can get a soil test done, that will help you determine what minerals can be added to enhance fertility. Adding soil amendments is only done once in the beginning of establishing a bed. ATTRA, A-T-T-R-A, the Alternative Technology Transfer for Rural Areas, has many free online resources for sustainable farming. They have given us permission to include in the documents section a paper discussing mineral content in a variety of homemade and commercial soil amendments. But before soil tests came along, people knew the soil quality by looking at the weeds that grew in it. And one source for that kind of information is a book called Test Your Soil with Plants by John Beebe. Different layers of soil have different levels of biological activity, and the biointensive method takes care not to overly disturb soil layers. If you have a clay-based soil, the soil is prepared by a technique called double digging. Here we have mostly sandy soil, and double digging is not necessary. If you have rocky soil, well, you're going to need to import your soil and have raised beds. In fact, if you can afford to buy good soil right at the start, just do that. If not, don't worry. You can grow your own over time. Growing soil is one of the foundations of the biointensive method. We mark the corners of the beds using this rebar and PVC pipe. The PVC can rotate easily when the hose is dragged around. Once the bed is laid out, you never step in the bed, but always stay on the paths. Stepping on the bed causes soil compression and damage to the roots. We use a kneeling board to distribute weight if we have to get onto the bed. Another key of the biointensive method is to conserve soil, space, and time. Seedlings are started in flats and then transplanted into the garden when they are large. Garden beds are only used by bigger plants. These are corn seedlings. Corn is not the best food crop in terms of calories and nutrition. We grow it because the kids love it and it gets them involved in the garden. Growing so intensively means you need to replenish the fertility on a regular basis. Before each new planting, we add a specific amount of compost. In this case, 3 to 6 5-gallon buckets of compost to a 50 square foot bed. Corn is a heavy feeder and needs a lot of fertility to produce well. Other plants like squash and turnips don't require much fertility, and the legumes like peas and beans add fertility to the soil. In the biointensive method, crops are planted in a hexagonal pattern at very specific distances, which maximize yield while minimizing the amount of soil needed. In a hexagonal pattern, you can fit in a lot more plants than conventional straight rows. There's much more to the biointensive research and the biointensive method. If you can't find a gardening teacher, don't worry. Take any gardening classes you can and hang out with neighbors who garden. Get the biointensive book and integrate as much as you can. The secret to a green thumb is mostly fertility. The majority of common vegetable garden plants need to have good, rich soil to produce well, and we struggled for several years with many losses before learning this fundamental lesson. Regardless of your soil type, continually adding compost is the main key to fertility. Clay soils, sandy soils, rocky soils, compost fixes them all. So how do you make compost? Basically, you need lots of organic matter. If you recall, in the biointensive method, with the 40 growing beds, 28 of those beds are for growing organic matter just to make compost. Fertility is that important and that challenging. The plants in those 28 beds are sometimes called carbon crops. Making compost is easy. We've included several documents describing various composting methods in the documents section. Here's a brief overview, though. For the purposes of compost, all organic matter is divided into roughly 2 categories, browns and greens. Some examples of browns are dried plants, hay, newspaper, cardboard, and leaves. Some examples of greens are green plants, fresh grass, vegetable scraps, and manures. To make compost, you make a pile with a 50-50 mixture of greens and browns, you add water, and you let it sit. Turning the compost every few weeks will speed up the process. In a little while, nature will work a miracle, and you will have this rich black stuff that is so good for your plants. We have numerous compost piles. Our most high-quality compost is our worm bin. Worm castings make an excellent fertilizer. We use this compost for brewing compost teas and for inoculating special areas. Brewing compost tea and manure teas are also an excellent method to help increase fertility. Teas can be brewed at home with just these simple supplies. We have directions to get you started in the documents section. Our second best compost pile is under the rabbit hutches. Note that these piles are protected by the garden fencing because chickens and dogs can easily mess up a compost pile, so the fencing is important. Now, chickens put out a lot of manure when they're roosting at night, and here is a very simple compost pile under this roost. So even though the birds are completely free range, we can still utilize their waste by simply developing a compost pile underneath where they choose to roost. Unfortunately, this happens to be on the top of our little shed. Note that the manure from pure herbivores like rabbits, cattle, or horses can be put directly on the garden. But manures from chickens and turkeys are too hot and need to be composted first. Actually, all manures will do better if they're composted with other things for a while, but we know how you can't wait sometimes. This is the classic way to do compost piles, using pallets to help generally keep the material confined, and yet it also lets airflow into the pile. Unfortunately, during drought conditions, we don't have enough organic matter to fully utilize this area. Also, don't forget your own waste as a source of fertility. Human urine is approximately 18% nitrogen in a highly plant-available form. The nitrogen content varies depending on your protein intake. To use urine, dilute it 10 to 1 and apply to leaves or root areas. We know several people who use primarily urine to feed their vibrant gardens. Carol Steinfeld has written a book called Liquid Gold. According to Carol, your urine has enough nitrogen to fertilize half to all of the plants needed to sustain you. The Humanure Handbook is the classic reference for composting human manure. Human feces can safely be composted and used in the garden or orchard. It takes about a year to fully compost out the pathogens, and yet there are a lot of other places in the world where they don't wait that long. Tom Watson developed the Watson Wick, which is a type of septic system designed to be able to safely use human waste to directly fertilize fruit and nut trees. If you need to redo your septic, or if you need to build a new one, this is an option to consider. We do another form of composting, which is very crude, in our garden with our footpaths that also helps with grass suppression. We line the paths with whatever organic matter we can find. Old junk mail, newspapers, old cotton or wool clothes, phone books, whatever. We cover it with hay and then water it in. Most inks are soy-based, and most glossy paper is clay-based. And if a little bit of plastic gets in there, well, it'll decompose eventually too. How much water your garden needs will vary by many factors. For example, on hot, clear days with high winds and sandy soil, you're going to need lots of water on a daily basis. On cool, overcast, still days in clay soil, well, you won't need to water at all, probably for several days to a week. You'll also find that different parts of your garden have different needs. And even within a bed, there are variations. For example, the corners tend to be drier than other areas. There's an old gardener saying, "Water the edges and the center will take care of itself." A key concept to keep in mind is that you're watering the soil, not necessarily the plants. A classic way to tell if you've watered enough is if the surface of the soil is shiny for 5 seconds. Since we use a lot of mulch to help conserve water and can't really use the shiny method, we feel the soil around the base of the plants about 2 inches deep to get a sense of the moisture level. We found that fully automating the watering system had us lose touch with the plants. So currently we water mostly by hand. And occasionally we water with a small sprinkler on a timer that we move around. We usually water in the early evening before sundown. If it's really hot, we water in the middle of the day to help cool off those struggling plants. Now the exception to that is sweet potatoes, which need some stressing to grow their tubers. Wind causes stress to plants and dries out your soil, and that's why we have this windbreak all around the garden. On the outside of the fence, we are planting perennial evergreen bushes, which will become a natural windbreak as this material is only a temporary solution. Of course, the windbreak bushes we plant will be something useful or edible or medicinal. Getting the right amount of sunlight to your plants can be very challenging. Using the shadow maps we mentioned earlier is an easy way to check out just how much sun each part of your garden is getting. In most locations in the Southwest, in the summertime, a lot of plants do better with some shading from the intensity of sun. In our garden, we use these small, fast-growing trees down the middle of the rows to provide shade in the hottest months. The two trees we like to use the most are Leucaena and Moringa. Both of these trees are native to tropic climates and die back with the first freeze, which is typically mid-November here in central Texas. This is good as we don't want shading during the winter months. We are filming in early June and the Leucaena is already up and going. This plant grows rapidly. It will soon be providing the shade we need. Here's what the Leucaena looked like in August of last year. This row was planted specifically as feed for rabbits, and we have realized that this close of a spacing, about 1 foot, is too dense a shade to grow anything underneath it. Planting the trees 3 to 4 feet apart makes a better level of shading and sunlight for the vegetable crops underneath. These rows are oriented north-south, which allows sunlight during morning and afternoon hours, but gives a light shade during midday. Both the Leucaena and Moringa are heat and drought tolerant with many other uses. Leucaena is in the legume family and fixes nitrogen in the soil with its root system. This helps to fertilize the other plants grown around it. Also, Leucaena's young pods, leaves, and seeds are edible. The dead trunks left behind in winter can be left in place to make an easy structure to drape with protective coverings, or used as a scaffolding for vining plants. All parts of the moringa tree are edible and/or medicinal. The leaves of the moringa are highly nutritious for humans and livestock alike. The moringa seeds can be used to purify water. In addition, these trees with their transpiration of water helps create a lush microclimate in the garden, cooling the area and reducing your water usage. There's just a tremendous amount of research available on both these trees, as they are used extensively in developing countries to alleviate hunger and malnutrition. See the document titled Plant Allies for Southwest Gardens, along with other information in the Documents section. Also, we will have more to say about Leucaena in the Perennials and Other Essentials section of this DVD. Most insects are beneficial to the garden. Malcolm Beck has written the classic book, Texas Bugs, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which has some wonderful insights into the many dynamics of insects in the garden. In his book, Malcolm explains that nature primarily sends in insects to attack only weak or unhealthy plants. So the main answer to all bad bug problems is to make sure you have healthy plants. We have a two-step process for dealing with serious insect outbreaks. First, we let the chickens or guineas into the garden for a short time. The poultry have a preference for insects and they eat them first. We watch them, and when the chickens have finished the bugs and start eating the greens or scratching up the beds, well, then we run them out. The second step is we immediately address the underlying issue of weak or unhealthy plants by adding some fertility, checking the watering, weeding, mulching, or whatever is necessary. Some other more preventative techniques we use to minimize bug problems is we rotate our crops using different locations each year. This helps to disrupt insect reproductive stages. We use this graphical snapshot every few months to keep track of what was planted where. And although this is not a complete record-keeping system for the garden, it is quick and easy, and actually sometimes it's all we can do. Another technique is to always have a few things flowering in the garden, as that helps to keep the good bugs in the area. The good bugs often eat the bad bugs. Sometimes those flowering plants are just simply weeds, sometimes they're old crops on the way to seeds, and sometimes they're intentionally planted. Another option for bug problems that we are learning about is to eat insects. Some of them are downright yummy, and it sure turns an insect problem into an opportunity. We used to get very hung up trying to find the absolute best variety of vegetable plants. While having a good variety that is heat or drought tolerant does help, having good soil, adequate moisture, and the right amount of sunlight is by far going to get you more success. Your local garden club or gardening neighbor is the best source of varieties to use. Buying seeds in bulk and sharing with neighbors is a very cost-effective way to get seeds. To store seeds, the key thing to understand is that seeds lose their viability with exposure to moisture, light, and heat. Ideally, seeds should be stored in around 5% humidity in the dark below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If you have a refrigerator available, store seeds in a tightly closed jar in the fridge. The cupboard above the stove is not good. Saving seeds from your own plants is ultimately the way to go. You can get crops that are highly productive and specifically suited to your soil and climate. We have included in the Documents section an excellent beginning book on seed saving written by Bill McDorman. Start out with some of the easier seeds to save, such as beans, tomatoes, or okra. These do not need to be isolated, and the seeds are large and easy to handle. It really does take about a decade to become skilled in growing your own food. Getting started can sometimes be the hardest part, but here are some suggestions to get you going. First of all, get a compost pile going. Then start with one garden bed. Only add another bed every other season as your experience and skills grow. Initially, buy some starts from the garden center and wait to try starting from seed until later. Take all of the gardening classes that you can and visit as many gardens and farms as you get the chance. Get the Biointensive Gardening book by Jevons and start incorporating as much of his methodology into your efforts as possible. Don't worry yourself with seed saving or companion planting, moringa or leucaena or moon phases until later. We know there are pressures to get as much going as soon as possible, but starting small will really be the best use of your resources. Be prepared for failures and just keep on replanting. If nothing else, life will surprise you. Rabbits are an easy food source to grow in a very small space. In our garden, we have an 8-cage rabbit hutch. Each cage has 5 square feet of space. 1 buck and 3 breeding does take up 4 cages, and the remaining 4 cages are used to grow out the babies. You can get about 90 rabbits a year from a setup like this. The rabbit wastes are composted directly below, and this is almost more important than the meat or the fur that the rabbits provide. A rabbit hutch needs to be a comfortable space for the rabbits. They don't need a lot, but they do need to be protected from the elements. Using as much natural shade and protection as you can will reduce the building costs. This direction is east, and the rabbits get a lot of protection with shade in the morning from natural shade. There's a thick hedge on the north side which provides some break from the northern winds. But our setup here is not ideal. That direction is west, and often the afternoon sun comes in here and it's too bright. Even with this overhang, it's not long enough. We use these feed bin covers and this tarp to provide some extra shade. Our roof is made of scrap metal, and metal seems to magnify heat and cold, so we've put extra insulation under here. The tarp also serves as an extra roof insulation. Placing the rabbit hutches on this side of the garden would have been a better location because they would have gotten natural afternoon shade from these trees behind us. We would still need the same roof, insulation, and tarp, but it would help the rabbits to be more comfortable. We use cages made with 1/2 inch by 1 inch wire mesh. This close spacing is to prevent snakes from getting in, and it's also easier on the rabbits' feet and prevents what's known as sore hocks. We regularly stuff hay into the rabbits' cages, not only for them to eat and chew on, but also for them to burrow into on cold nights. Each buck and doe needs its own individual cage. A newly weaned young litter can stay together in one cage for a while, but they need to be separated into smaller groups as they get older. Rabbits raised from babies together generally don't have a problem being in the same cage as they grow. But grown rabbits need their own cages or they will fight. Keeping the cages clean will keep your rabbits healthy. With these wire cages, most of the pellets and the debris falls through to the compost pile below, but they occasionally need to be cleaned. Rabbits need access to fresh water both day and night. Your watering system can be as simple as having a bowl in each cage. There's also some simple plans for making waterers out of old plastic bottles. To reduce the amount of work and maintenance, we use gravity-fed water from this tank to nipples in each cage. The system is easy to set up using 1/2 inch PVC. Note that the piping under the roof is insulated to prevent freeze damage, and this setup can go down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit without problems. If we think it'll get colder, we simply drain the system using the valve and refill again after the freeze. Rabbits are herbivores that eat greens that mostly don't compete with human needs. You do not want your rabbits too fat or too thin. Fat rabbits don't breed, and they don't tolerate heat as well as the lean ones. Too lean and they'll have health problems. Feeding them at a set time of day is also the best. In the spring and the fall, when there's such vigorous plant growth out here, almost all of our rabbits' diet just comes from the garden. Collecting greens for the rabbit is much more interesting than plain old weeding. A rough guideline is to give the rabbits about as much as they can eat for one full-grown rabbit in an hour. We give lactating mothers and babies 2 to 3 times that much, 2 to 3 times a day. A mature rabbit can maintain body weight just on grass and hay alone, but growing babies and lactating mothers need more protein. They need legumes like peas or beans, or vetch leaves, which are high-protein sources. A reason for growing the Leucaena in the garden is for the excellent high-protein rabbit food. In the warm season, rabbits eat Leucaena, moringa, sweet potato greens, mulberries leaves, and almost any kind of grass. Mostly in this garden is Bermuda and Johnson. In the cool season, you can feed them vetch, rye, oats, lettuce, beets, winter peas, and greens. Any time of year we feed them garden weeds, Yopon holly leaves, prickly pear cactus pads, and hay. Rabbits' digestive systems can get bloated and kill them if you feed them old or moldy foods, so we only feed them fresh. Also, avoid feeding plants from the nightshade family like potatoes or tomatoes, or the mustard family like turnips. Also avoid broccoli and cauliflower type plants. Since many of the plants have low levels of toxins in them, don't feed more than 10% of any one kind of plant. During the late summer and the winter, we're using commercial rabbit feed for about half of the rabbits' diets. A grown rabbit on a maintenance diet only needs one of these small cans worth of food each day. But give mothers and growing babies as much as they want. In the documents section, we've included a research paper by Labas on the nutrition of different feedstocks for rabbits. This paper is very helpful in determining the quality of various foods. Also, the folks over at World Hunger Relief in Waco, Texas are working on quantifying a local sustainable diet for raising rabbits in Central Texas. The most common breeds of rabbit for meat are the New Zealand White and the California. But don't worry too much about breeds in the beginning. Just get almost any kind of common and inexpensive rabbit to start, preferably grown and near breeding age. The reality is that with almost any new livestock you get, some will die for some reason or another because of your lack of experience. But do your best and don't get discouraged. We started out with some inexpensive mixed breed rabbits, which we've liked because we could tell them apart from their coat colorings. It took several years of raising rabbits before we started to look at what to select for in a rabbit and the details of the breeds. Rabbits breed like rabbits. Rabbits have powerful hind legs and sharp claws. Always wear protective clothing over your wrists. You can bleed to death pretty quickly from cut wrists. We keep an old sweatshirt on a nail here just for this purpose. When breeding, always take the doe to the buck. When the buck falls off, that's a take, and it really does happen quickly, just like all the jokes suggest. We have our does on a 2-month breeding cycle. We breed her, and 24 days later we give the doe a nest box with hay. Before putting it in the cage, we clean out the debris and let it sit in the sun for a few hours to sanitize. The doe will start to pull fur and make a nest. Within 28 to 32 days, she'll kindle a litter of 6 to 8 babies. We check the nest daily to see if the mother has kindled. Don't worry if the mothers don't look like they're doing much or if they're not very involved with their babies. Mother rabbits don't do a lot of cuddling or pampering. We limit our involvement with the young at this time, although we do check the nest to remove any that may have died. After touching the babies, we always touch the mother's nose so that she has our scent on her and won't reject the nest. Rabbits are amazing in that you could breed the doe again immediately after birth, but that is too harsh on the mother's body. We've also found that if you breed her on too long of a schedule, she has a harder time getting fertilized. The does do seem to be more fertile and receptive while they are still nursing their young. So we breed her again in the 4th or 5th week after giving birth, and we wean the babies in the 5th or 6th week. We can get 4 and sometimes 5 litters a year from a doe. They have a very hard time with fertility in the heat of the summer. This setup with 1 buck and 3 does yields approximately 90 rabbits per year, or almost 2 rabbits per week. In the documents section, we have an article about raising rabbits in the backyard, which is a good complement to this video. The author of the article, Dr. Lukfer, is also co-author of one of the best overall books about rabbits titled Rabbit Production. Don't forget your local 4-H club, which is open to adults as well as youngsters. In many bioregions, it's easier to raise animals than to grow vegetables or fruit. The primary vegetation in this area is grass and brush, which animals can transform into edible protein and fat. Animals also deal with temperature swings and climate variations much better than vegetable plants and most fruiting trees. The argument that meat is a wasteful luxury is true when applied to commercial operations which feed grains to fatten animals for meat. In the systems we are presenting here, the animals are specifically chosen because they are herbivores or insectivores that eat food stocks that do not compete with human needs. A necessary part of the food cycle is the killing and processing of animals. Rabbit fryers are harvested when they are about 2 months old and weigh somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5 pounds. The carcass will dress out at about 50 to 60% of live weight, and about 75% of the carcass is edible. The process is easier if you don't allow the animals to eat for 12 to 24 hours prior to butchering. Rabbits are a good backyard food source in that they are easy to process and can be done just before cooking, so you don't need refrigeration. The butchering of all animals is about the same. Deer, goats, raccoons, chickens, all are similar with only a few minor variations, and all of them can be done with a simple pocket knife. Using hooks set up on a board or hangers for larger animals does make the job easier. Most people use other tools like tin snips to cut off feet and specialty cutting tools, and these do help save time. We will demonstrate here with just a knife so that you can see that it can be done without anything more complex. Any knife will do, the sharper the better. We prefer high-carbon steel blades as they can be easily sharpened manually. A good knife doesn't have to be very expensive. The Swedish Mora knives are only about $15 at this time. The downside is that they do tend to rust and they need to be sharpened frequently. Stainless steel blades stay sharp for a long time and don't rust or discolor, but they're very difficult to sharpen manually. Having a clean area to work in with running water makes the process much easier. It's not necessary though. Many hunters completely field dress deer in the woods with only a pocket knife and a bit of rope. Please understand that this is not a commercial kitchen and these methods are only for meat you intend to eat at home. I'm not particularly good at this and I really don't enjoy it. Professionals working in rabbit processing plants can completely process a rabbit in less than 90 seconds. It still takes me about 20 minutes. Fasting for a day or two before the butchering helps for the first time you try this. Hunger gets you in touch with the reasons why you're doing it. My intention is always to make the kill as quick and as painless as possible. Animals rarely die right away, and there usually are a few moments of spasm in the bodies. Om Triambakam Yajamhe Sugandhim Pushtim Vardhanam Om Kanir Vavimavan Sugandhim Pushtim Vardhanam. The first step is to wet the hide down because if you've got running water to do that, it keeps the fur from getting all over the meat. Some people cut the heads off at this point and bleed them for a little longer. It's a bit cleaner to just start skinning, and I prefer to do it this way. Let's get that out of here. One of the first steps is to cut the fur off from around the hocks. Cutting fur will really dull a knife edge, so once there's an opening, get your knife in under it and skin from underneath. pull the skin off. If you are saving the skins for tanning, it's important not to use your knife, but to pull the skin off, as the knife cuts make the tanning process more difficult. Now you just pull the fur off. It gets amazingly physical here. But the rabbit comes right out. Cut the skin from around the forefeet and neck, and then cut off the head. Cut the tendons and then snap the feet off. It's easy if you just cut that joint. And then twist it or pop it off. Now, since you've already broken the neck, the head will come off real easily. I'll just go ahead and put these parts in a plastic bag to save as dog food for later. The hocks are similar to the front. You just break that tendon and then, oops. Okay, now at this point, since we've got a little bit of mess, I'll often rinse them off just to clean things up a little bit. This one got a little bloody on me. They usually aren't that bad. Oops. This is where we get to the point, and see sometimes you do have tremors. The rabbit is not alive, that's just his body. Make a slit in the belly and there are the guts. Examine the organs as best you can. Each time you'll learn a little more of what a healthy rabbit looks like. Having a reference book to check helps a lot. I use the rabbit production book mentioned earlier. So here's the big colon. See, he hadn't eaten for a while, so there's not much in the colon, which is what I did. I didn't let him eat for like 12 hours beforehand, and there's not much in the rectum, although you can see some pellets. Now here is the liver. Generally, the first organ to learn is the liver, checking to see there's no abnormal color, inflammation, or scarring, or any worms or discoloration. And this guy looks pretty healthy. It's a pretty nice looking liver there. Some people eat the organs, especially the liver, heart, and kidneys. Native peoples ate the intestines. A lot of people do. And they just pull right out. There's really nothing to it. Put them on a plate. And we'll have a doggy that really wants to eat that. Now you want to get the kidneys out. And this fat by the kidneys is highly prized in some cultures. And again, the fat in the kidneys. You can just pull, cut out some of this tougher membrane. But you've got your lungs here, and I must have already pulled the heart out already. Just your lungs. And we are, basically done. I'm just going to clean this meat up a little bit, and also maybe I'd cut out the tail and the anus. I might just cut out some of these other lower pieces because they're not something we're really going to eat. A lot of people don't eat the skirt either. We often cook it just to make it into stew meat. Go rinse this guy off. Often just rinsing through. Okay. Now I'll just kind of feel around with my knife here. It's not an exact science by any means. Not for me, anyway. After rinsing the meat, I usually quarter the carcass for easier handling. Turn him over so you can see him a little better. Often just cut the back just to make it easier to get it all in a package. And there you've got most of your pieces. That's if he's going in a freezer. The good thing about rabbit, though, is you don't need to refrigerate them. They come in family-sized packets. They grow a lot of rabbit in third world countries for families. It's a good protein source. At this time, we primarily use the organs for feeding the dogs. We also feed the dogs the heads, the feet, and sometimes the skin. After stewing an old rabbit, we give the dogs the bones, and in this way we often get 3 or 4 meals for the dogs out of one rabbit. Now, some tanning you can do with simple chemicals, and in those furs we'll package up and put in the freezer, but some skins, since we've taken it off like this, and it's almost like taking a sweater off of somebody, you can just put it over some 2x4s and let it dry like that. We have some articles explaining those methods in the document sections. We've been experimenting with using fire ants to clean off the excess fat and skin from the hides, and this is an example of it. and it actually turns out to be a pretty good tanning job. Make sure you put the hides where the dogs can't get to them. We have read that you can use the skins to make glue, and there's the possibility of selling the fur to hat-making companies. If nothing else, the skins make good dog food. Other than rabbits, you are most likely to butcher an old hen or extra rooster. Older birds are best cooked by stewing, and in that process the skin is not critical. Since skinning is faster than pulling feathers, we often skin those tougher birds. But for chickens that we want to keep the skin intact on the carcass, the process has only small modifications from the butchering of a rabbit. First, the bird is killed by cutting into the neck or brain, and the blood is drained into a bucket. Next, we dry pluck any feathers or down that we want to keep. Then we dip the birds into hot water, which is around 180 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 2 minutes, which loosens the feathers and makes it easier to pluck. Note that a simple fire pit can be made out of an old barrel and some pieces of rebar. A metal garbage can works well if you don't have a big pot. After soaking in the hot water, we pull out all of the feathers. Then it's very similar to rabbit processing, in that we cut off the heads and feet, we remove the anus and tail, we open the abdomen, and remove the guts. Next, cut out the craw, which is a sack of small rocks the chicken uses to digest food. It's located near the collarbone. Rinse the meat to clean it, and you are done. All of the scraps can be fed to the dogs. When butchering other animals like goats or raccoon, there are small glands that you really want to remove. They are usually near the skin and often go out with the skinning process, but check with someone knowledgeable before butchering them. Having chickens in your yard is a real delight, and chickens are a valuable part of your food production system. There are many different ways to keep chickens. Our criteria of using little or no commercially bought feed and doing as little work as possible shape the system that we've developed. We have a small flock of free-range poultry primarily for egg production. We found that raising chickens for meat was impractical, as a flock of 50 to 80 chickens is needed if you're going to eat one a week. Even with several acres, that is a large flock to feed, and you will have to buy commercial feed if you have that many. For us, we found that 10 hens and 2 roosters is ideal. In a suburban backyard, 2 or 3 laying hens would be good. Most hens will lay an egg a day except for when the weather is extreme and during their molting season. Hens will lay eggs just fine without roosters. But if you have room for one, the roosters really do care for and protect the hens. By the way, it's a total myth that roosters crow at the crack of dawn. Some of them will crow all night. You can do us and everyone else a big favor by eating those 2 a.m. crowers. The breeds of chickens are broadly divided into meat production, egg layers, and dual purpose. We only have egg layers or dual purpose breeds, as we use rabbits for meat production. The most common breeds are Rhode Island Reds and Barred Rocks. These are the classic yard chickens, and they do great as dual purpose birds. We are currently focusing on the Brown Leghorn, which is an egg-laying breed with a reputation for good production on forage alone. They also handle heat very well. Many older Texans recall the Brown Leghorns as the only breed in their yard when they were children. Don't go crazy worrying too much about specific breeds in the beginning. As with the rabbits, your first job is figuring out how to keep them alive. There's so much to learn, and there are so many other creatures that like to eat chicken. The reality for many beginners is that there will be losses. It often seems cheaper to buy chicks and raise them yourself. You can buy day-old chicks from the local feed stores, or you can have them mailed to you from hatcheries. Baby chicks are quite fragile and need specific warmth, water, and feed. Expect losses if you haven't been through the process before. And actually, you can expect losses even if you have been through the process before. It takes about 4 to 6 months for a chick to grow into a hen and start laying. She can lay for 3 years or more. Buying grown laying hens is the easiest way to get started, and if you only need 2 or 3 for your backyard, that's the best way to go. The trouble of raising chicks is definitely not worth it for a small number of chickens. If you keep chickens penned up all of the time, you will need to provide them with their entire diet, which is about 4 to 6 ounces per day of high-quality grain for laying hens. Joel Salatin, a well-known pasture-based poultry farmer, states that large flocks of chickens allowed to forage on rotating pastures will require approximately 3/4 of the grain needed for penned chickens. So you get a little bit of savings on the amount of feed you need. Pastured turkeys need approximately half of the grain needed for penned turkeys. We have found a small flock of up to a dozen chickens running free range on our upper acreage lay a good amount of eggs without any supplemental feed during typical weather patterns. In a large suburban backyard, 2 or 3 laying hens could work out well without needing any feed and only a little bit of food scraps every now and then. If we use commercial feed, we throw it out under the trees, and the chickens will come out here and scratch and weed for us. They will not be able to do a complete weeding job, but they do help. There are lots of other creative ways to get feed for your chickens right from your own land. In warm months, we often use traps to collect large quantities of high-protein bugs to feed the chickens. A pan of water under almost any light at night catches a good amount of bugs. This time we've caught mostly June bugs, which the chickens love. If you come across any old putrid meat like roadkill, put it in a bucket with a loose lid or some holes drilled in it and feed the ensuing maggots to the chickens. It works, although the stench is a bit hard to deal with. We are planting trees like mulberries and hackberries as a low-maintenance and easy source of food for the chickens. One supplement we have not been able to figure out how to get for the chickens here on farm is calcium, which they need for their eggshells. We currently provide them crushed oyster shell, which we just leave at the base of a tree for them. They have free access to it whenever they want. All livestock need access to fresh water. For our free-range birds, we have several buckets fed via rain barrels. When we have to pen up some birds, we use this bucket and trough setup. The bucket holds the water that goes into this homemade trough with a small float valve. And this chicken tractor has a rainwater system with waterer built in. Just a simple can with water works well if their time in the pen will be short. We found that this style of commercially available waterer works well. These plastic ones are difficult to use and easily grow algae. Our chickens are completely free range, which means we do not keep them in a coop in the day or night. They roost in the trees. We like this approach as the birds can get those early morning bugs and go about their business without our having to open or close any doors. Having a dog or dogs to protect the poultry at night is essential if you want your poultry to survive in a free-range system like this. If you do not have dogs to protect your poultry, then you will need to have a very secure coop for them, and we mean secure. Those predators have all night, every night, to figure out how to get in. We've learned that raccoons will dig to at least the length of their arms before they give up, so having a protective skirt of at least 8 inches around the outside of the coop, or walls buried at least 8 inches deep, is necessary. We recommend a strong, small opening wire mesh for the sides of the pen. Chicken wire is actually not that good. It's not strong enough and the openings are large enough for some snakes. You would be amazed at how wild creatures can figure out how latches work, and raccoons easily open doors secured with multiple bungee cords. Lots of folks do keep chickens safe in coops, but be aware that there may be some losses while you learn what works and what doesn't. For sizing a coop, a general guideline is that each bird will need to have about 4 square feet of space. If you're not going to let them out during the day, you need an additional 10 square feet per bird. Chicken coops need to be cleaned out about once per week. Since a lot of hens lay early in the morning, many folks have a system of keeping the chickens penned up until mid-morning, letting them out after they lay. You will need to provide some feed for the chickens for the morning and give them a bit of feed in the evening to entice them back into the pen. The big upside is you get all of the eggs. One of the downsides with totally free-range chickens, without having them in coops, is that we don't get 100% of the egg production. So, it's Easter all the time. We've gotten good at setting up places where we know they will want to lay. It's not as hard as it sounds. Even with a free-range flock, it's a good idea to have a small coop or pen. When you get new birds, keeping them in a pen for a few days helps them to get acclimated to your yard. And sometimes you need to isolate birds or separate them. A chicken tractor is a small coop you can move around. The idea is that the chickens will weed, till, and fertilize the area inside the tractor, and you don't have the chore of cleaning out the coop as you just simply move it to a new location. We found that this was not very effective for deep-rooted weeds like Bermuda grass, and moving the tractors got to be more work than it was worth. but the chicken tractor can be useful in some situations. Keeping a small flock of chickens for eggs is an easy-to-implement piece of your food production system. With a small free-range flock, you can basically get eggs for free with little or no input in feed. Using a small coop or buying feed is a good way to start. Your first time as a chicken owner, expect some losses and don't get discouraged if you have to try several times before you get the predator protection, feeding, sheltering, and watering all worked out. We found that dogs are a critical part of our food production system. We went through heavy losses in plants and livestock before we finally got the dogs. Come on, girls. Come on, Farm Dog 5 Spot. Let's go. Come on. Even in a suburban backyard, a medium small dog would be an asset. You may not realize all the predators your neighborhood has. We tried everything to keep the poultry alive or the deer out of the orchard without the dogs, and I mean we tried everything. Dogs are a much simpler solution and they do a lot of other useful work. These dogs are outside working dogs. Their main job is during dusk, dawn, and night. It is a natural thing for dogs to chase off predators like deer, foxes, squirrels, and raccoons, and some dogs bark at hawks and overhead predators. These dogs are not pets, and it does take time to work with them to teach them what they should and shouldn't be doing. We've seen a lot of farmers and gardeners just dump a dog out there expecting it to know what to do, and later getting angry when the dog goes to eating chickens, tearing up garbage bags, or doing something undesirable. These dogs have other jobs than predator patrol. We are currently training Farm Dog to pull a cart. Dogs also can do herding. Another important part they fulfill in the system is eating meat and bone food scraps. Unused meat products attract fire ants and other predators. If the dogs didn't eat it, those items would have to be carried a good distance away each day. Dog-human partnerships can be far more productive than most people realize. We had very little experience training animals prior to getting our dogs, and we're certainly not professional dog trainers. But here's the information we started with and suggestions we followed that have worked for us. A good dog can have an understanding of vocabulary similar to a 3 or 4-year-old human. Having an expectation that your dog is intelligent and wants to please is the foundation for developing a good working relationship. Start communicating with your dog using simple words or specific whistles. Keep in mind that learning anything new requires many repetitions. Reinforce desired behavior with either treats or praise. Let your dog know you are unhappy with a low, growling tone of voice.
Good girl.
Remember to hold an expectation the dog will learn and wants to do a good job. It is a good idea to regularly do some leash work. If you have a bigger area, walking around your boundaries lets the dogs know what they are to
We don't mess
protect.
with that, do we? Those are goose eggs, huh?
Yes, you can train a dog out of eating chickens after they've done it. You do have to be harsh, and you may have to repeat the process 2 or 3 times, but they do learn. Both of these dogs ate poultry in the past, but they've learned not to do it anymore. Our dogs are fed from butchering scraps, table scraps, eggs, and what they can hunt. We rarely buy dog food. Yes, you can feed your dogs the raw butchering scraps from the animals they are to protect. Dogs understand property rights. Feeding the dogs at random times keeps them more attentive to us and their work. When we had the dogs on the set schedule, they got lazy and irresponsive, only showing any interest at set meal times. We've also found that overfeeding them made them fat and lazy. They usually get fed once a day, typically in the mornings, as we want them to be a bit hungry at night while they are working. We also give little treats at other random times. Please be aware that dogs enjoy eating human feces, and it's a huge risk for disease. So if you're using outhouses, latrines, or human manure composting, make sure the dogs cannot get access to the feces. We have the dog houses near where the poultry sleep. We feed the dogs in that area, and water is available there. When they are reprimanded, Farm Dog 5 Spot, go home. This is where they go for time out. We used to have a kennel, but found that a chain hung from a nearby tree is more effective for restraining them when needed. To make sure the dogs have easy access to every area we need protected, we cut this hole into the fence which lets the dogs through but keeps the geese in. We intentionally only have 2 medium-sized dogs. The dogs need to be big enough to handle the larger predators, and not too big so we don't have to buy feed for them. In a suburban backyard, a 25-pound dog would be a good size. Having dogs a bit on the smaller side means that they sometimes need support. For example, when facing a pack of javelina or a group of coyotes, our dogs sometimes need help. Their barking lets us know, and our human presence often scares off the predators. Yes, that means we get up in the middle of the night to protect things sometimes. On occasion, the dogs have treed a raccoon or cornered an armadillo, and this is an opportunity to get meat either for you or for the dogs. These dogs are half Pyrenees and part heeler and other mix. We spend a lot of time looking for good working dogs. That does not mean registered or purebred. It means we've seen their parents and grandparents at work herding or protecting livestock. If you can find a grown trained dog, that is best, as puppies are a lot of work. If you can't find some actual working dogs, then staying with breeds that have been working with humans historically is a good bet, such as the Pyrenees or the heelers or border collies. Good dogs are invaluable partners. Our food production system is highly dependent upon them. They do take time and effort to train and work with, but it's well worth the effort. Perennial plants are an important part of your food production system. Perennial plants are bushes, vines, and trees that you plant once and they continue to grow year after year. They require time and energy from you with little returns in the early years, but as they mature, they're easier and much less work than annuals. There are many resources available that focus on perennials that are edible and or useful. The Complete Book of Edible Landscaping by Rosalind Creasy and Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tosmeyer are two examples. Forest gardening or food forest are terms used to describe methods of food production based primarily on perennial plants. Robert Hart, a modern proponent of forest gardening, began to focus on perennials as he and his brother were getting on in age and needed systems that were less labor-intensive than annual vegetable gardening. An important point for all of us to consider. The biggest challenge with perennials is finding the right plants and locations for them so they will thrive and produce with the least amount of effort on your part. A house or other building creates different habitats called microclimates. The west side of the house tends to be hot and dry. Often a big deciduous tree is planted on the west side of the house, so the house will be shaded in the summer and warmed in the winter. If you don't have a big tree for shading, then this is an area for those southwest desert plants like yuccas, cacti, or Mexican oregano. Mediterranean plants like olives, rosemary, and grapes can also work well. We have a small nursery on the east side of the house. The east side has that precious combination of morning sun, afternoon shade, and close proximity to your daily attention that will support more tender non-native plants. The southern area of our house has partial shade and is an edible lawn, which this summer we are growing watermelons, black-eyed peas, and assorted birdseed grasses. These are not perennials, but annuals that can reseed themselves year after year. Wild edibles such as plantains, lamb's quarters, and dewberries also show up in the lawn. The northern side of the house is an area for plants that like heavy shade. In addition to the plantings around the house, we are developing two perennial food areas, one in the post oak thicket and the other in the orchard or forest garden area. A hill also creates microclimates. If you recall, at this site, the barn is located on the top of a hill. So we chose the north side of the hill for our orchard, which we hope to evolve into a forest garden. The post oak thicket is a project where we are planting within an existing forested area. As the desired young trees grow, we slowly cut out the surrounding existing trees. Almost all plants require watering in the first year as they get their root systems established, and most will require ongoing watering and fertility beyond the first year to produce well. Forest gardening methods can ultimately develop food production systems that do not require irrigation after they have been matured, but those are very long-term projects, and they also require lots of water in the early stages. It sounds obvious, but make sure that you have your watering system set up before you plant. Most of the plants around your house can simply be watered via a hose. Of course, you can also set up automatic irrigation systems. In the post oak thicket plantings, we move a hose around to water planted trees. This area has lots of shade, and we have built berms behind the base of each tree to help capture and hold water. The leaf fall from surrounding trees also gets caught in the brush we've put in the berms. This creates a natural, almost effortless mulching system that also helps to retain water. Even in the heat of summer, we only need to water about once per month in here because of the shading, berms, and mulch. We found that watering once a month, dragging a hose to all the different trees here, was not that bad of a chore. There's only about a dozen of them that we irrigate in this area. The orchard is irrigated by a more complex irrigation system. The water is fed via gravity from the rainwater tanks up on the top of the hill. There are no pumps in the system, only valves to let the water flow or stop it. The main water line is a 2-inch diameter pipe. There are 4 levels of the orchard where we have 1-inch lateral lines. The dimension of piping in an irrigation system is critical. Get somebody knowledgeable in sizing if you're going to be running very large lines. In gravity-fed systems, the available water pressure is usually low. This mister is operating at about 8 psi right now. The first level in this orchard is just about 18 to 20 feet below the level of the water tanks when the water tanks are full. For gravity-fed systems, a key formula you need to know is that for every 10 feet of drop in height, you get 4.33 psi in water pressure. Most irrigation equipment expects at least 20 psi or more, which is a common household level. Even though they're not rated for this low of a pressure, just try several different varieties of misters and sprayers, and you'll find one that will work well enough. In clay-based and loamy soils, drippers in the soil disperse water well. In sand, using drippers, we've realized the water just drops straight down, and we've switched to using misters as they spread the water over the root zone better. The great benefit to an irrigation system is that it saves a lot of time in watering. But be prepared. Once installed, the irrigation system will regularly still need maintenance. Drippers get plugged up, lines get cut or crimped, and hose connections leak. There are other methods to help retain water on your land. The 4 levels of the orchard are laid out to follow land contours, and the footpaths also travel along the irrigation lines on contour. As we walk on the paths on each level, the ground tends to get compacted on the paths. This hardens the ground along the levels, and this compaction tends to slow water down as it passes through the area. In other systems, people dig ditches on contour called swales that catch water, and it's a very effective technique. How much water do you need? As we discussed in the section on water, a general guideline is that most fruit and nut trees need at least an inch of rain a week. And an inch of rain translates into about 0.6 of a gallon per square foot. As the root system expands, you'll need to water more. In sandy soils, you'll need 2 to 3 times as much. During the heat of summer, we water trees once every 5 days. Just as in the garden, the key to healthy, productive perennials is the correct amount of fertility. And all of the methods discussed in the garden area are appropriate for fertilizing your perennials. In our orchard, we rely on 2 main sources for fertility: nitrogen-fixing plants and geese. Using nitrogen-fixing plants is appropriate for any size yard, and they should be used in every system. Using geese is only practical if you have at least a half an acre or more. Even if you don't have room for geese, it's a good example of how to integrate animals into your food production system. Nitrogen-fixing plants are the long-term key to fertility in the orchard. To review, the nitrogen fixers are plants that have a beneficial relationship with bacteria on their roots that allows them to get nitrogen from the air. Yes, a healthy soil should have some air down in it. Most of the nitrogen-fixing plants are in the legume family and come both as annuals and perennials. Planting annuals around your trees like peas and beans in the summer and clover and vetch in the winter help to increase the fertility of the area. You get the most nitrogen benefit if you cut them down and use them as mulch before they go to seed. In addition to annuals, we use a lot of nitrogen-fixing trees. Most of the nitrogen-fixing trees have other benefits than helping to build soil. They are often fast-growing, provide a nice dappled shade, and have edible leaves or pods. Here are some of the nitrogen-fixing trees we have in this orchard. You've met Leucaena in the gardening section, and we use Leucaena extensively in the orchard. There is information on propagating Leucaena in the More Essentials section of this DVD, and written materials in the Documents section. This autumn olive is a small deciduous tree that fixes nitrogen and produces an edible berry. This one makes an excellent companion to this persimmon tree. Growing these trees together is a form of homemade fertilizer. Not only are the roots intermingling, but the extra leaf drop in the fall helps the persimmon. We're growing these honey locust trees with the intent that they will grow and become big canopy layer trees. The locusts are fast growing. This small seedling will become a big tree in just a few years. We planted this black locust only 3 years ago. It's done very well with almost no irrigation. If you noticed, it's planted in a ditch on contour. We are planting these honey locusts not only for their nitrogen-fixing properties, but especially for their long, sweet pods, which are similar to those on mesquite trees. Just like the mesquite beans, you can make a syrup or an intensely sweet flour from the pods. We have recipes available in the documents section. We're especially interested in using the beans as a homemade sweet feed to keep our cows happy and interested during milking time. We have a lot more information available on nitrogen-fixing trees in the documents section. Geese are a good complement to an orchard if you have room for them. We put fresh water into shallow tubs placed beneath our fruit trees. The geese love it, and they bathe and preen, copulate, and of course defecate in the water, making a good old mess, which is wonderful stuff for the fruit and nut trees. We rotate the tubs around the orchard, and every tree gets this liquid fertilizer every 2 or 3 months. We found the Chinese geese are excellent egg layers, laying from approximately October to March here in central Texas. A goose egg is delicious and huge, equivalent to 3 or 4 chicken eggs. We collect and eat the eggs until about February, when the hens start setting to raise up a brood of new young goslings. Geese primarily eat grass and actually show disdain for grains unless there's nothing else available. They don't eat many broadleaf plants, but they do eat some. They do not eat bugs. They require shade in the summer, as everyone in Texas does, but no significant housing in the winter because they do have goose down. They need fresh drinking water every day. We use buckets gravity-fed from drums. These buckets simply need to be turned over each day to be emptied and then filled back up again with water from the drum. You should have 2 of these drinking water buckets for redundancy, and so you can slip off for a day if you need to. Goose meat is a dark, short-grained meat and is very tasty with no overly strong flavor. As with any livestock, goose is always better young, but we have eaten them several years old. Just boil the meat on a low heat for several hours and use in stews. Geese can fly a little bit, but it's more comical than practical. A 2 to 3 foot fence easily keeps them confined. Geese will need protection from predators. If you don't have a dog for protecting them, they can be trained to return to a pen each night. The fertility is the main reason we have the geese. Getting eggs, down, and feathers and meat is a real bonus. Filling up the water buckets and pans is a daily chore which can be skipped occasionally, but it's basically free fertilizer and is much easier than hauling in manure or compost from other sources, which we don't really have anyway. Finding the best species of tree for your site can be difficult. In southwest climates, the trees that are easiest to grow produce foods you probably aren't used to: mesquite beans, persimmons, jujubes, autumn olives, prickly pears, and yuccas. The majority of fruit and nut trees sold in nurseries and catalogs are grafted trees. That means the bottom part of the tree is from one plant, and the top part, which will bear fruit, is from another tree. Grafting ensures you get a known quality of fruit, like a Jonathan apple or a Granny Smith. Some seeds, like apples, produce highly variable trees, and you have no idea what the fruit will be like, and most often in apples, it is bitter and sour. We initially started out with all grafted trees because that is what is widely available, and those are the fruits that we were familiar with. But we rarely plant them anymore, and we do not recommend them. Most grafted trees are inherently weaker and shorter-lived than trees grown from seedlings. The fruit from native or well-adapted trees is not as familiar as the grafted trees, but in a lot of cases it really comes down to having any fruit is better than none. And when some of it escapes, you'll be helping your bioregion in providing good genetic material for food stocks for the area. There is a whole world of plants out there that produce edible or useful parts. Another resource to help you is a free online database of useful plants called Plants for a Future. Although the species we have growing here may or may not work in your area, we'll go on a quick tour of some of our trees to give you some ideas. These peach trees were some of our original plantings. They are all grafted trees on semi-dwarf rootstocks. In this region, it is typical to expect a good crop in peaches 1 out of 3 years. We are still trying to decide if the amount of fertility, water, and work is worth the effort. This June Gold here was our only producer this year. We got about 35 pounds of fruit from it, which if you check in your Grow Biointensive book, you'll see that that's at the low end of the possible yields. We're experimenting with these peach tree seedlings that we got from a friend. We're hoping that they'll produce a lot better with much less care. Some folks are very concerned about invasive species. In our opinion, if a plant produces something edible and useful or fixes nitrogen, then please invade us. This particular 5-leaf Akepia vine is probably a problem in other bioregions with higher rainfall. But here it has produced a delicious fruit within the first year with very little water and minimal care. If it starts getting out of control, we can use it for compost or check its edibility for livestock. These persimmon trees were planted 5 years ago, and they've produced for the last 2 years. Here in Texas, trees with thorns seem to do the best. These 2 jujube trees were planted 5 years ago. They have not yet started producing. We have planted several mulberry tree seedlings this winter. These trees grow quickly. Not only will the mulberries be good for us and the chickens, but the leaves are good forage for rabbits. We got this elderberry as a root sprout from a friend. It's only a year old and it sure wants to be here. These are pawpaws. These are East Texas natives. This plum was planted 5 years ago. Most of the blossoms this spring got killed by a late frost. This is a grafted tree. In the future, we will be planting some of the good native plum trees that are hardier and more productive. Acorn meal is delicious and makes great pancakes. We are tending these oak trees just for the acorn crop. For more information on how to use acorns and recipes, see the documents section. The best time for planting most trees in this region is in the fall. That way the trees can get a good start on their root systems long before the onslaught of summer. We find that trees that come in this size pot are the optimal size. They have a big enough root ball to get established, and yet they're still cost effective. Bare root trees seem to transplant just fine, but since most of them are grafted trees, we don't use them anymore. We have had losses as high as 90% of the trees planted at a time. Some of this was our own ignorance, and part is because this is a very difficult region to grow in. The good news is that as trees get older, they get stronger and are easier to maintain. Hopefully your losses won't be that high, but be prepared to have failures. Even native and well-adapted trees are going to need care for the first years to get established. When trees are young, they must be weeded, especially from grass. Some weeds bother trees and some weeds don't. We've seen lamb's quarters and grass essentially starve a young tree to death. These cowpen daisies and camphorweed do not seem to bother the trees at all. Learning these relationships is hard won. Mulch is extremely important in the summer months to help retain moisture. The absolute best mulch is wood chips, as their slow decomposition involves a fungal process that is also very beneficial to the tree. Wood chips are expensive and not easy to get, though. So if hay is what you got, use hay. Cut weeds, leaves, pine needles, corks, old cotton clothes, all those things also work. Our normal rain cycles are heavy 1 to 3 inch rains once or twice per month. Under those conditions, we like a thicker 4-inch mulch which absorbs and holds a lot of that moisture. During drought conditions, when rainfall comes in thinly 1/8 or 1/4 inch splatters, then our mulch is just a thin layer. Hopefully the size of your yard and your budget will limit you to only a few trees to start. Don't torture yourself with an acre. Talking with neighbors and maybe getting some seedlings from them is the best way to find good plants for your area. Befriend the folks at the native plant nursery nearest you. Other local nurseries and sometimes the county extension agents can be helpful. Set up your watering system before you start digging. Plant nitrogen-fixing plants at all levels first, the herbal, the bush, and the tree layers. When you think of fruit, ignore your grocery store background and start exploring what grows naturally in your bioregion. You may already have some food sources such as oaks, yuccas, or mesquites in your yard. When you choose your trees, go for the native or well-adapted seedlings that will produce with the least amount of water, fertilization, and attention. And since you are exploring unknown territory, be prepared to make a lot of mistakes. A very important distinction the biointensive method teaches is thinking in terms of crops that provide calories, crops that provide nutrition, and crops grown primarily for making compost. When thinking of calories, the Irish potato is the main vegetable that comes to mind for most people. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to sustainably grow Irish potatoes in much of the Southwest. In order to germinate, the potato needs to get below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The seed potatoes for this bed were shipped to us from Idaho back in February. We just harvested them in early June. We will be storing them through the summer in a cooled room using air conditioning. Without the transportation and refrigeration that cheap energy provides, potatoes are not a viable crop for this region. An alternative to the Irish potato is the sweet potato. The sweet potato is as efficient in caloric production and space requirements. It grows during the hot season and can be stored easily in our climate through the fall and winter. Amazingly enough, the sweet potato does well in less than fertile soils, and it needs to have stress to grow big tubers. There are varieties that are less sweet and more like Irish potatoes. Other high-calorie crops that are good in this climate and are space efficient are peanuts and sunflower seeds. One of the challenges with sunflower seeds is in processing them. We have included an article in the documents section on how to dehull sunflower seeds using a grain mill. There is also some good information on oilseed pressing. While grains are good sources of calories, they require larger area and more fertility to grow, and the processing of these is real work on a homestead scale. Grains are currently a big part of the American diet because they lend themselves to mechanization, and historically, grains were grown using vast amounts of slave labor. At the time of this video, grains are still very cheap and they do make excellent supplies for backup food. But if you plan on growing them for yourself, be prepared for lots of work. This food dehydrator is a design from Appalachian State University. Air enters through here at the bottom, and as it heats up via this window, it moves upward through these racks out the top. The heat inside is surprisingly uniform among the levels of trays. We have found this to work excellently and have it full throughout the summer and fall harvesting times. Detailed plans for this particular model are available from Home Power magazine. There are simpler ways to accomplish the same thing. We have a less expensive design provided to us via J.R. Whipple in the documents section. The main principle to keep in mind is that the nutritional content in food goes down with exposure to sunlight. Some of the herbicides used in commercial hay fields can kill your garden plants right after the first rain if you use the hay as mulch. The herbicides also pass through the intestinal tracts of animals, so they can show up in manures like horse, cattle, and rabbits fed the sprayed hay. There is a fairly simple home test which we do if we luck into some manure or hay but are not sure of the source. The principle is that legumes are very sensitive to herbicides. So grow a small flat of almost any kind of pea or bean. Take a bucket and fill it about halfway with the suspected material. In this case, we're testing some hay. You can do the same thing with horse manure, cow manure, or whatever you have. Add a lot of water to it and make it very soupy. Stir it every few hours or when you think of it. The stirring helps aerate it. After about a day or so, strain off some of the water from the soup mixture and use it to water the beans. If they live, the hay is okay. If they die, better not use it. Looks like this flat's okay. There are two main things we've learned about fire ants. The first is that the anti-fuego mix developed by Sabino Cortez and Malcolm Beck is highly effective against fire ants in addition to other insects. It is commercially available in local nurseries, but it's also easy to make at home. We have a short write-up in the documents section describing how to make it and several uses of the mixture. Basically, it's made from orange oil, compost tea, and molasses. The principle is that the orange oil dissolves the exoskeleton of insects. The compost tea provides microorganisms that further destroy the insect, and the molasses feeds the microorganisms. A homemade orange oil is made by simmering the rinds of citrus and skimming off the top layer of oil. A molasses-type syrup is made from mesquite or honey locust beans. Check out the recipes in the document section. And any of your compost piles provide some microorganisms. The second thing that we've learned about fire ants is that if you totally wipe them out in an area, the cut ants move in. And cut ants can destroy your garden and orchard within a day. Since the fire ants do much less damage to crops, we've learned to live with them. We treat mounds in places we walk, and we leave them alone otherwise. Fire ants really like protein, especially meat. If we are having a problem with cut ants, we put out a bit of meat near the plants we want to protect, and the fire ants will come and end the cut ant problem. As we've changed our lifestyle towards more physical labor, we've had a lot of injuries. Cuts, bruises, punctures, scratches, lacerations, strained muscles, fractures. Having a decent first aid kit and knowing how to use it will become more and more important to you. Hog panels and T-posts are very long-lasting and very useful. We use them in many places for trellises and arches. Going vertical increases your effective garden space. We found that plants don't like clinging to raw metal any more than you would, too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. If we hadn't cleaned up the old vining debris from last season, we wouldn't need this plastic mesh for the plants to grow on. But the thought of a video camera suddenly got us busy. Here is a really quick gate. This is a great time to let you know that there's no such thing as temporary. We hung up this gate temporarily about 3 years ago. It uses fencing nails for hinges, and it's still working great after all this time. We've mentioned contours and level in the orchard and water sections. This simple setup with clear tubing, yardsticks, and stakes is how we determine water level over larger distances. Here are both stakes with the bottom of the stakes at ground level and even. Note that we put in food coloring so the levels would show up better on camera. Oops. Get that vertical. Here the stake on the right is at lower elevation. Here the stake on the right is at higher elevation. You move your level along, and when you've got it level at the second spot, you mark that spot with a stake. And then you'll continue to move it along. This is the contour which we've marked out for visibility. You can stew an old hen or cook up a big pot of beans with just a few handfuls of twigs for fuel. We do not need to destroy what little remains of our forest just for cooking. A rocket stove is highly efficient at transferring heat and is made from just a few old cans. Once you've got the chicken or beans to boiling, then wrap it up in anything that insulates it and put it in an old cooler or hay box. Take the pot out in an hour or two and reheat. It won't boil over or burn in this system, and it's a great way to cook foods that need long, slow heat. A lot of research and design for the rocket stove has been done by the Approvecho Institute. Some simple plans to get you started on making a rocket stove are located in the documents section. Eric McBay was kind enough to let us include his booklet with lots of useful information titled In the Wake. There is information on water collection, water filtration, latrines and gray water, quick lighting, and lots of other useful information in the event of a crash of the grid. Print it out just in case. Lucina is often started from seed in March or April in a protected area. The best directions for the process are in the World Hunger Relief Manual on Backyard Food Production. Here is an overview of the process. The seeds need to be scarified either by pouring boiling water on them or by nicking them with a knife or a pin. Let them soak for 12 to 24 hours. The seeds will swell up. Inoculate them with nitrogen-fixing bacteria if you can get it. Plant them an inch deep in the best and richest soil you can make. We often put 5 or 6 seeds in a pot as the germination rate is usually low. These sprouted after about 10 days. They grow pretty quickly. Transplant them out when they are between 6 to 12 inches tall, which should be in about a month or two from seeding. Dig a wide and deep hole. Double dig the bottom of the hole if you have a heavy clay soil. Add at least a gallon of compost to the hole. Add at least a gallon of herbivore manure to the hole. And add a few tablespoons of lime to the hole. This should be done even if your soil is alkaline. If your soil is really acidic, add more lime. Mix the old soil and added ingredients. Plant the seedling 3/4 of an inch deeper than it was in the pot. Water in well and water weekly. They will grow about a foot a month. In the second year, it comes back as a multi-trunk tree with an amazing amount of leaf matter.